Hello and welcome to the January 28th edition of the Cluster API Provider AWS Office Hours. Um, if you have any additional items that you want to add to the agenda, please go ahead and do so now, and also add yourself to the attending list. And it looks like Chuck's already added a link to the agenda in the Zoom chat. All right, to start with, the current status since our last meeting, we no longer have a blocker on Kubernetes version 1.13. We recently had a PR from Vince come through to update the dependencies, which also enables future work to streamline the kubeadm config and all of that fun stuff. And it looks like the next item from Tim is the current state of CI and artifact generation.
I just wanted to get a readout of where we're at with the test automation as well as artifact generation, and whether or not we needed to just pull the trigger on doing our own thing, just to get to the point where we get V1 Alpha 1 out the door. So it's more of a question than a comment for Liz and everybody else.
I sort of feel like we have pulled the trigger on doing our own thing. But if there is, I guess it depends on how much risk we want to take on and how much technical debt we want to take on. Like, we could use the Go things that I have written and just vendor them directly into the test. But that brings on a lot of risk and a lot of technical debt, and so that's sort of and there's still more work to do there. So
what's the TLDR on the state of the state? Like
the state of the state is we have things that can delete everything, and we have things that can list everything. I haven't plugged those things into each other, and we don't have the I've got an issue that shows the state of the state. I can add it to the document, but that's the upshot. Is we still need to glue everything together, get the new credentials into Boscos, and convince our test automation to talk to Boscos. And then we need to test it a whole bunch, but we're going to need to test it a whole bunch regardless.
What's the state of artifact generation currently? That's the state of sort of CI integration for AutoSpinUp. Do we have like a well-defined place for automation? So if we do an annotated tag, we can just generate artifacts?
My understanding is that Prow does not currently handle tag pushes.
There is separate machinery for that. That's outside of Prow probably. But I mean, do we have a hosting location for, because we can always kick a Prow job many different ways. If we can see the automation, we can kick it. The question is, do we have a place for all of the artifacts we're going to generate? And this includes AMIs. Do we have that story done or thought about and completed yet?
We have thought about it. We do not have that story done. Right now it's still hosted. They're still hosted on the old Heptio account. Whether we want to host those as VMware or do the effort to get AMIs hosted via the CNCF, that's a lot of work, and that will not happen for V1 Alpha 1, but we could start that work if we want to go that route.
I'm fine with punting on stuff like that right now, just so long as we just keep moving the ball forwards on both the CI automation front and the kicker front. So we don't have automation then, it sounds like, in place to do artifact generation.
Not all of them.
We covered AMIs, but we haven't touched on container images.
Container images will be much easier to get through the process of finding a home for those. They don't have a process defined yet for how to do that, but once that gets defined, it seems like a lot of projects are in the same boat as us, and they have container images that need to be pushed somewhere. Okay. So I think that process will be pretty straightforward.
So we should probably talk about it with copy then as well, so that way it's unified for discovery at least.
I think copy has a place on GCR, if I'm not mistaken. But maybe I'm mistaken.
Did you say cap E or a cap?
Yeah, cluster API.
Okay, I think they're using GCR also.
Okay. So
Also using GCR.
are you doing automatic generation though, or are you doing it separately?
We're not doing automatic generation yet. Yeah.
I think that answers most of my questions. It sounds like both need TLC at this point.
I think we do have lots of automation around it, but not a process that actually generates and push upon an event like a tag or something. But we do have all the scaffolding for it.
Okay, I think that answers my question.
All right. Nadir, I see you added something here talking about the customized artifacts.
Yes, so the issue is like if users right now have to go to the repo, and there probably is going to be a mismatch between what's in the repo and what's the current release. So made some changes to ClusterCuttle, which allows you to use customize, and the idea is to simplifies my gigantic PR that I've got. But the idea is they run some commands and it will spit out some customized templates, and then they can feed that into ClusterCuttle, and it'll be versioned with the binary and embedded in it.
And just to clarify, that helps remove the developer tooling from kind of the end user user experience when using Cluster API.
Yeah, they will only need customized and Cluster AWS ADM and ClusterCuttle, and they should be and kind and be able to go along the way. So there's a couple of things, but no Bazel, no make. I think it's quite important.
Yes. All right. And all right, moving on from that, does anybody else have anything to share for the current status of the project before we move on in the agenda? No. All right. So the next item is just kind of a general PSA. This is more upstream cluster API related, but it does have the potential to have a massive impact on the AWS provider. So Vince has been working with Robert Bailey on a proposal for splitting the cluster API into multiple API groups. So I know Tim potentially has some comments here, but is there anything you want to add first, Vince?
No, apart from the timeline is still being undecided. I think we will need to discuss this like next week. Also, because it's like a lot of work, so we need to see who takes up like how do we split the work, and then like what goes in which milestone and who takes up the work. But apart from that, I'd love more comments on it, and I will revisit probably today and tomorrow and present it on the next meeting on Wednesday, I believe.
So just for my hot take, I'm pretty adamantly opposed to breaking up the API group for V1 Alpha 1. I'm totally fine with it in a post V1 Alpha 1 world. The biggest concern I have is, and I'll bring this up in the other group, is the potential fragmentation problem that can exist because everyone will have to rebase and it'll be a non-destructive level of set of changes.
Yeah, and the change doesn't have to be destructive at first. We can take some, like this is like a kind of where we want to go, right? Like on your point, because I see how this can impact a lot and like a lot of providers and just like derail like a V1 Alpha 1, and that's not the goal of the PR. But it's a good way to like get an agreement in the community, like what we want to do, where we want to go, and it will resolve the problem, for example, that we have right now of like having only one cluster per namespace. And say like, okay, like we don't want to like split apart the cluster and machine actuator for now because this is where we want to go, and so we can punt that work for later. So I completely agree, and I think there is some ways that we can include some changes in V1 Alpha 1 and punt like the big changes for later. I don't know if Jason dropped.
Yeah, his home network dropped.
Okay.
Wynn's gonna ask a question here. Sorry.
Yes.
So who is going to benefit this breakup into groups?
So that's a good question. So I think even from a cluster API AWS provider perspective, we would benefit of having, for example, like an infrastructure actuator, which is going to be separate, given that like right now, like in the current way of things, we have the cluster actuator, which will create the infrastructure. And the next point that I was going to bring up was the network specs. So bringing user-defined infrastructure, for example, VPC, subnets that users or customers have already defined, and they want to say, I want to create a cluster in this network. So right now, like that, the spec that I put out, it's kind of, I don't want to say a full hack, but it's more like, how do we fit these things in? And if we can have a way to like split that apart, I think that would be much cleaner, like a longer term, and it will help resolve the issue of like how many clusters can we have in a single namespace, what defines a unique cluster, and what is the relationship between cluster, machine, and control planes.
I think we're conflating API groups and the separation of the API groups with the constructs of what's currently being done. I don't think that the separation of the groups themselves really has, I don't think any of the problems that you previously stated can't be solved currently if the APIs are well structured enough. The API grouping comes with its own set of constraints, but again, we can defer this. There's a bunch of other, you're gonna open up a set of other problems that will arise as a result of this, namely different providers, in this case would be most likely Red Hat, would want to set up and version it potentially independently for the machines API. So if you had independent versioning, then you now have versionitis across your API groups. And that's almost the antithetical opposite spectrum that we want to get ourselves into. But like we can have this whole conversation in the CAPI meeting. But it's a long conversation, and I think this is possibly not the best venue for that particular conversation. So next topic, I think, Jason, you're back.
Yes, I am. Nice, fun little network blip there. So it looks like the next item on the agenda, if we've beat that horse enough, is Vince with his network spec proposal.
Yeah, so this is, I think, the issue 267 to support existing VPC infrastructure. This is a lighter change. It just brings a concept of a managed and unmanaged network scenario. We still will create security groups, but we won't create VPC subnets, routing tables. So pretty much like all the primitives. But the goal is to like make it like simple enough to like say I want a cluster in this VPC and mark it as managed by like a convention. So if the ID is there, it's going to be pretty much managed. This is a breaking change because it will move IDs and from the status to the spec. So we'll need to like existing cluster probably won't work. Yeah, I think we're in alpha. So.
Well, technically we're pre-alpha, so
even better.
You know, breaking changes right now are not a big deal. Once we solidify on our V1 Alpha 1 release, that's when we'll have to start taking into account how to actually manage breaking changes in a non-breaking way.
Yeah, and I think this is good that goes pre-alpha because I mean this is probably going to be one of the like first class citizen like to bring your own network spec, and I think I fixed all the comments that Jason that you made on it. I will repaste the PR and make sure that it's up afterwards. But if anybody else has feedback or user stories that they want to share, that would be great.
I noticed that the tag is different from the one we use in the AWS provider, the AWS cloud provider. Is that deliberate?
Which tag are you referring to?
I guess the ownership tag, or
I think we use name AWS provider managed.
Yeah, it says like cluster API, sigs.case.io, cluster API provider AWS managed.
So we add an additional tag. So we do put the kind of the shared management tag, which is used by the cloud provider integration, as well as other tooling like Hops. But we also added an additional tag to be able to potentially differentiate in cases where there may be, some other tooling managing resources as well.
Okay, that's surprising to me, but okay.
Well, just because but if we're talking about like ELBs or something that the cloud provider can spin up, it's a way for us to differentiate something that is spun up and managed specifically by the AWS provider versus the integrated cloud provider. That's that type of thing.
That is fair enough. I think one of the things that works well when you look at the sort of Kubernetes level tags is that then you delete load balancers that are created, even if Kubernetes doesn't necessarily delete them. So you should probably still look at deleting things, even if they aren't tagged with your tag. And then
I think that's
tag.
Well, I think that's definitely a fair point. I think for having the additional tag, that helps us know, for kind of mutation purposes and things like that as well.
Okay, cool.
All right, Vince, looks like you have the next item as well.
Yay. So this is an importance improvement. We talked about this, I think, like a few months ago. So another issue came up, like about cleaning up resources that Cluster Carol spun up. I was wondering, like, to what extent do we want to like clean up dangling resources, and if we should do this in V1 Alpha 1 stage. As far as the other points in this PR, I think they're all actually covered. The tags are actually at important now, like after the 218 went in. So the only leftover is the second point, ensuring proper cleanup of resources if rollback is needed. Because from what I understand, like people could like just do cluster control delete at this point when it works. That said, like there's always going to be a way to orphan resources if like, like an early failure or something like that. But this is true for like also like, CloudFormation or like Terraform, stuff like that.
So this is Andrew. I'm kind of new to this call, and I'm just trying to listen. But I do a lot of the similar workflows for another project, and all I'll say is most people probably have their own cleanup scripts, so it probably wouldn't be too hard to get from there to what you're talking about, Vince. Simply because if you do the dev test cycle enough, eventually you break things, right? And you have all these orphaned resources out there. So we all have these variations of cleanup, reconcile, or destroy force. So I think like the distance isn't too great. It depends on the size of the problem for the user, I guess.
Yeah, I'm more wondering if like we should punt this work for this specific topic, the cleanup of resources for cluster curl for the next milestone, given that like we don't have. I'm not sure like if that's necessary to go this milestone.
So I think the important thing is as long as we document kind of the cases where we could orphan resources and how we, attempt to tag resources and our naming conventions, things like that, it gives users a starting point for kind of self-cleaning up those resources if needed.
Yep, makes sense. There's always going to be a way, like some ways, like tags are not going to get applied, right? Like, and at that point, shrug, like.
Lack of cleanup also affects CI testing, right? Like,
well,
yeah. Go ahead.
So there's a couple of issues there as well because similar to the point that Justin brought up, there's also additional resources that could be brought up in cluster that could potentially lead to orphaned resources as well in the CI kind of environment.
Yeah, Liz's option that she talked about earlier is very nuclear. It's like a semi-periodic account cleaning.
Nuclear in a good way, right?
Well, depends on your definition of good. It's like it's not the ideal world, and I think this is an AWS problem more than anything else, right?
Yeah, it's really a problem that only exists in this form on AWS. Azure and GCE both provide a project-like abstraction that handles this use case very well. AWS just doesn't. And so we're left with the two options are basically, the sort of classic journaling garbage collector where you keep track of every single resource as it's allocated, or the nuclear option of you terminate the program to stop memory leaks. And those are really all we have.
I have a question for Justin, and I'm sorry if this has been asked before. Like, how does, for instance, how does testing in the CI, testing of COPS, clean up after itself?
So COPS will try to clean up after itself and will delete any tagged resources, including ones that were created by the cluster. But we, in addition, in CI, have a sort of the AWS janitor script, which the nuclear option sounds good compared to this, but here we are. Every hour, I believe, it scans all the resources, writes them down, and if they're still there in, I think, 2 hours or 4 hours, it deletes them. So the argument is no test runs for more than 2 hours. So we can change those numbers, but that's the way it works. But the important thing, there's no dependency on COPS there at all, right? There's no handshake.
Right. So yeah, COPS tried to clean by itself, knowing in the metadata that it has, right, stored somewhere in like an S3. And if that doesn't work, then the script takes over the rest. Okay.
Exactly. I think that the big difference for COPS is that for COPS, the janitor script is, if I understand it, sort of a script of last resort, and you assume in most cases COPS will clean up after itself. Does that sound right?
It's definitely supposed to, but it definitely catches stuff, yes.
Yeah, but in our case, we don't really, this is going to be the primary means for cleaning up. Part of this is also, though, just reading through the AWS Janitor code base, it looked to me like COPS kept a journal because I saw it reading objects out of S3, and I think that was just me not understanding where those S3 objects came from.
Yeah, that's a journal for the janitor itself or something, or it's not. It's a COPS also uses S3, but it's a different log. Gotcha. There are some hard-coded things where we ignore certain tests that we know take longer than 2 hours. I think there's a stress test, for example. And when we clean up DNS names, we try not to delete the DNS names that we're really using, for example. So it's not great code, but it works.
And this is for scheduled tests, right? These are not for PR tests.
I don't think it really cares, to be honest.
I mean, I guess my question relates to volume, right? If you have one of these tests per PR, you could potentially end up with a bunch of dead resources, orphan resources in the back, and that might cover the questions coming in, the new tests coming in for resource limits and stuff like that, and quotas and whatnot.
When the janitor script goes wrong, we do see tests that fail because they hit limits on the number of volumes, for example. But the janitor is what keeps the machine going.
Yeah, that's part of why we need to move full end-to-end test verification into periodics and not PR blocking on upstream.
So instead of, in addition to tags, whenever possible in AWS, for RCI, I also create objects with identifying information in the actual object name, like a load balancer, for example, so that if the tags don't get applied, there's still some amount of filtering I can do. I don't know if that's in use here, but tags don't always get applied. But if an object's created, it always has a name if it allows any type of custom name.
The problem with that is that if we're creating well-known names, all of the tests are going to create the same well-known names.
Okay, I didn't know if you had types of prefixes or anything like that.
I mean, we could, but like, how would we know what prefix was associated with an individual test? So it would be very difficult to like have a shared AWS account and clean up just one test's set of resources.
The name could have multiple parts. It doesn't have to be statically dynamic or whatever, right? You've got the group name and then whatever. It depends on the length of the object name.
Yeah, I think we do store some of this information. It's just that I think Vince was talking about this earlier, the delete functionality for a cluster is just not 100% there yet.
And we do try to do that, for example, on COPS, where every job has a name. We can figure out a unique name from it based on either the PR number or the SHA that we're building. And so like COPS, for example, sets up a DNS name, which is obviously a singleton. And it more or less works. There are one of the major causes of leakages in the COPS tests are we sometimes see that Prowl will run the same job twice in parallel for reasons unclear. And that is weird. But yeah, that sometimes causes just confusion all the way down. So yes, having a name collision is bad, as it says, but it is possible to mostly get it right.
Yeah, if the strategy that I have, I feel like the strategy that I have adopted is the most robust. If we decide it's overkill and we want to do something else for the sake of expediency, I would love to discuss that, but I don't know that this is of particular interest to everyone here, and maybe we should take that discussion offline.
Agreed.
I just like the other really nice thing, Liz, about your approach is that you avoid API rate limit quotas by having different accounts. So that's actually really nice.
Yeah, we avoid that. And as far as I understand it, I have plenty of people who are willing to provision basically as many AWS accounts as we want. So once we populate Boscos with those, we should have a lot less interactions with between accounts. And the interactions we do have will be a lot more obvious because it'll be, hey, I couldn't check out an account, not, hey, something's weird about this account. So, but yeah, we can take this offline. If you look in the document, there is a issue that I linked to, and that's where I'm putting all the discussions of all of this work. So feel free to watch that issue, comment on it, anything like that.
Yeah. All right. So moving on. The next item is from Justin about documenting the reasons why we're using ELB v1 versus an NLB or an ALB.
Thank you. Yeah, so I just wanted to, I was having a look at what you used for the load balancer for API server. COPS also uses ELB v1. I think it is I believe it to be a valid decision, but I also know that a lot of people are always looking at this saying, why are we using ELB v1? Why aren't we using ELB v2? Why aren't we using ELB? And so I was going to confirm that that is a deliberate decision and sort of try to put, it seems like you have a nice doc where these decisions are documented. And then if we put those reasons into I'll send a PR to put the reasons into the doc, and then we can have something to point to when people ask why this one. I just wanted to sort of gather any reasons that I may have missed. I saw a great one from Nadir, I think, about loopback or hairpinning rather. I don't know if there are any others, but otherwise I will send a PR and hopefully we can agree that ELB v1 is the way, unless someone thinks that ELB v2 or ALB should be what we're doing. But it feels like I heard it.
Yeah, as you said in the comments, ALB we threw out because of the TLS reasons. We're using it for all of the API communication, so that throws away kind of the client-server authentication there. And the NLB, as Nadir said, was mainly around hairpinning, especially when using a private subnet. It just doesn't work out of the box right now, and nobody's troubleshot down far enough configuration to make it work in that environment. So
the other thing I'm aware of with NLB is that if you have one IP per zone, and you have to manage your sort of failures yourself if you lose all the backends in a zone, which is not unlikely with masters.
Yeah.
There's lots going on in chat, but yeah, I will collate some of the stuff in chat as well. Skate. Okay.
There's nothing on that, nothing else on that topic. We can move on. Loke, questions about machine stamping?
Yeah, so Tim approached us about a week ago about the machine stamping. Apparently you guys have a machine stamping process, and there's a desire to make it more universal. We're also doing using a machine stamping for the vSphere provider. And let me first, before I go in and explain the machine stamping, so there's two. I'm going to discuss the vSphere cluster API provider, and then I'm going to talk about another project that we've done in the past. There's actually two artifacts that need stamping. One is the installer OVA. I mean that actually becomes a VM when you install it, and the other is the what you would call the node image, which I think that's what you guys are mostly stamping. Okay, so today in the vSphere cluster API provider, why don't I share my my screen? Okay, because there. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you guys, okay. So if we look at the cluster API vSphere provider right now, we have this folder here called installer. And inside of this installer, you simply just run make and another parameter, and it will build you it will stamp out an installer OVA. And this process is purely container-based. We don't use any external tools like Packer, and we don't require a hypervisor. It runs completely inside of Docker. So like I said, there's two artifacts that needs to be stamped, right? The installer OVA and then the node image. And today, the node image, we also need a stamping. We do have a stamping requirements there. And let me explain what it is that we need. The stamping of the node image today we rely on the users to upload a cloud init image into vSphere and create a VM template from that. However, there are some internal projects that requires a custom cloud image. Today, we're using a cloud init image that we customize so that we can pass data between the VM, the resulting VM during the startup process, and so the question comes up: where do we store that image, and how do we create that node image? Right now, the other project, they're building it themselves and they're bundling it with the OVA. It's not the most ideal situation because you get into the question of how do you upgrade that node image. I've been thinking about this process, and I was I worked on a previous project that built a container runtime. And the way that we did machine stamping was so convenient. I was thinking that, man, I wish we had that in the Cluster API. So without further delay, I can actually just demonstrate you guys this. So let me first explain. So I worked on a previous project called VIC, vSphere Integrated Container, and what that was a runtime that runs on vSphere, kind of like Kata container and Windows containers. All containers are run as VMs for stronger isolation, and it doesn't require. We don't have Docker bits running underneath. So why don't I just go ahead and demonstrate this? And I'm going to show you. Okay, so I have right here, I have vSphere running inside of Fusion. So it's a nested ESX. And here, okay, it's a clean system right now, okay? So now if I bring up, so now I have a couple of alias. So I got two alias here. So the a Vic create and Vic delete. So I'm just going to go ahead and do a Vic create. So it's installing Vic right now. And then we're going to run some containers. With this, and then we're going to explore underneath how the stamping works. So while it's doing that, let me explain the process. Okay, so if you want to run a container on vSphere, you just use Docker, but you point your Docker host to Vic. And whenever you run a container, it pulls down the image, it extracts out all of the layers inside of the image, and then it stamps VM decays for each image. And then you can run the container as a VM. So let's go ahead and come on. Okay. Okay. Okay, so now if we do Docker info, we see that it's we're targeting the Vic runtime. So now if we did images, there's no image. Okay, so we pulled BusyBox. So what we're seeing right now is it's pulling down the Docker image, and it's actually creating a layer. Oh, what's going on? Okay, maybe I need to connect to the VPN. Okay, never mind. It's just a little slow. Why is it so slow though? Okay. So it pulled down. It's usually not this slow. It was it's strange. It was so slow. So now if we did a run IT BusyBox top. So you see here now we've created a VM from that container. And then I'm going to show you underneath that we did a lot of, okay, so it's running. So I'm going to just quit from that. Now, oops.
Hey, look, while you're going through that, what's the TLDR on this that you're showing us?
So we were discussing this last week on the internal cluster API, and there was a mention of a desire to possibly run to basically automate stamping of machines from a Docker container. So if you have something like I assume you know what Kind is. It's a project that runs a Kubernetes cluster inside of Docker. So if you have something like Vic, you can actually run the Kubernetes cluster by just running Kind on Vic, and it does all the stamping for you. Let me explain at the end. I just want to. So now we have Vic Docker.
I think I see where you're going with this. You're basically auto-creating VM images directly from Docker containers.
Yes.
And if we do Docker automation, just like a standard Docker file, we can get the latest up to greatest thing just by publishing a Docker image and then use that to auto-stamp VM images.
Yeah, so this was an idea that I proposed to the Vic team when I left them, that they could actually easily create a Kubernetes cluster by running a bunch of images that then uses kubeadm to bring up the bootstrap the nodes, and by doing something like this, you can actually have multiple images of Kubernetes on your running environment. So there's a couple of benefits to this. First is that the stamping is automated, and second is the images are stored somewhere. And
I get the gist. I actually really love the idea. The question I have is logistics. Like, does this work for all the different providers besides vSphere, right?
I'm not proposing that we're doing this. I just it was a discussion that we had on Friday on the internal Slack channel about having something like this, and I said that, well, you know what, we actually do have something like this inside VMware, and I wanted to show it to you. So the third benefit is that now you have a common language, which is the Docker file, to create the node image, and there's built-in versioning.
I love it, actually. I think it's a lot clearer than some of the other stuff.
So this is actually very similar to Linux Kit,
which
Ilya brought up.
Yeah.
One main concern that I would have is if we did try to adopt this type of approach for AWS, would we be losing any type of kind of AWS optimizations that are present for kind of the OS base images that would not necessarily be present in kind of like a generic base image for an OS?
Hi there. So I think James Nugent did some similar stuff at Joyent and added some stuff to Packer to enable some similar workflows. There's a couple of issues. You ultimately do need to spin up an EC2 instance to write the image. There is a VM import thing that AWS support. Unfortunately, you can't actually use that to spin up normal EC2 instances. So there would still be something that looks like Packer or Amazon Inspect or Amazon Systems and Simple Systems Manager to do that bit. And I think the other main concern would be things around systemd stuff where you need to interact with system services, which are not normally running on the Docker image, to do the final configuration.
Was that a comment or a question?
That's a comment.
Okay.
Are you sure that you actually need to have an instance running with systemd in order to configure systemd? I believe it can be configured through files.
Quite possibly. Yeah, there's always certainly, but there's going to be an edge case, right, for like on one of the.
I can tell you can configure that without systemd. That's exactly what we're doing today for building the OVA that Luke was showing you on CapV. We're actually using just standard script files on a Linux machine to build another Linux machine that runs systemd. So you can totally do that. There's a bunch of, things you have to be aware of, but all in all, it works.
I think Jason's question is kind of left unanswered because cloud providers or OS providers typically do customize their cloud images to be tailored with specific optimizations for the providers. The question is we're going to have to, I don't know if we'd have to somehow bake into that information into the Docker files or Docker configuration to make it seamless, unless anyone knows if that exists already.
Are those optimizations as relevant for, this is, never mind. I was thinking this was for the Docker images, but this is for the base images.
No, we don't actually have to base it on Docker, but that system already exists, right? Docker build, there's a Docker registry, there's a versioning approach. So building it on top of something like Docker images is reusing a lot of functionality. That would be really nice.
And I would hope that we would, as I imagine it, we would have different Docker build files, as it were, for AWS versus GCP, because there are different drivers, but the bulk of that work should be identical. And then there are a couple of lines at the end, which are like install the AWS optimized network driver versus, actually, I don't know if GCP has an optimized network driver, but like let's pretend, versus install the GCP optimized network driver.
Well, then we're maintaining those kind of layers for each of those cloud providers as well, versus being able to consume those from kind of provided base images from the OS provider itself.
And there's not really a guarantee it'll apply cleanly as a layer. Like maybe they're nice in distributed KOs, but quite possibly they're not. And, we're going to have to compile those KOs ourselves, or, maybe they've done some weird hot patching to the kernel images they're building. I don't think this is all super straightforward.
I would say it's certainly not straightforward, but I think the argument is that we know how to deal with it with Docker builds, or at least the model of Docker builds, right?
I think
sorry.
I think the model is very clean, and it gives you a certain level of idempotency that guarantees that you don't get as well when you're using other tooling. But there's a lot of edge cases here, and I don't think it's fully. There's a lot of questions that come along with it. I like the idea. From an idempotency perspective, I think I like it a lot. But I don't know if we can do that today. Go ahead, Liz.
My question, my thing was just to clarify for me, we're talking about the AMIs that we eventually install on the nodes that we're provisioning with Cluster API. And I think that's using Docker to build VM images that are not intended to run in Docker. That I don't know how much of our existing knowledge we can rely on for that. Is that something that we are already doing now? Is that something that other people are already doing?
LinuxKit does it.
it's possible.
And I just wanted to add that, when I do mention LinuxKit in this context, we don't necessarily, if I were to suggest to use LinuxKit within this project, I would say you could actually use LinuxKit without using Alpine and all the LinuxKit packages. You can just use the build tools and create your own packages, which could be fairly monolithic and don't have to use containerd and all the other bits. It just, there's a very basic feature of LinuxKit that basically lets you compose a set of Docker images into an AMI or a VMware image or whatever there is, or just a image you can DD onto a USB stick.
So the question I have is, do any of the providers do a lot of this work for the image layers today? Not the OS providers in particular.
Or like cluster API providers. Tim, was your question, more specifically, you were referring to cluster API providers or cloud providers?
Well, I guess it'd be three questions. The OS provider, cluster API provider, and cloud provider.
So
I believe each of them has.
So for most of the basic OS providers, I think somebody would have to manage the underlying kind of base OS image that we would use here, because all of the existing kind of container images aren't meant to, be full host OSs. Alpine is the only one that I'm familiar with that is running with the LinuxKit tooling today. For the cluster API providers, most of them are currently today are actually trying to install the binaries as they go with a given base image. So they're not really looking at image stamping like we are with AWS and vSphere right now.
How do you guys do image stamping today? Is it in your repo right now? Is it something that I could look at?
It is. It's Packer and Ansible based today.
Okay, and you're just building the node VMs from images, right?
Correct.
So there's two hats. There's like the short-term Kappa hat, and then there's like the long-term SIG cluster lifecycle hat. Like from a Kappa hat, I don't think it's possible in the short term to address migration of stamping in the short term. Given the open questions. In the long-term SIG cluster lifecycle hat, this sounds very interesting and promising, and I would love to see more work in the open possibly on this, because it has the potential to it has the possibility and potential to eliminate a lot of issues that are going to exist with how we create images for cluster API across all the providers, right? That being said, I think there's possibility here, but I don't know. I don't think this might be. Kappa itself might not be the right venue, even though I asked you to come here, and I appreciate the update. I think it's really useful, and I think this is more generic. It could apply to everybody if we get it right, but that would take a while. That would have to be resourced separately.
How do you guys? Where do you guys store your stamped machines today? Is it a manual process? Somebody stamps a machine and then puts it somewhere, and the end user needs to know. Okay, so do you guys feel that you guys have a storage hosting issue also? Because that's the question that we've been stuck on, is where do we host these custom images?
So the way that we've looked at it so far is that anybody who is using this for real production workloads in any type of kind of non-trivial environment, they're going to want to provide their own base OS images anyway, whether it's from a regulatory standpoint or just a corporate process standpoint. So we provide for those users, we provide the tooling to be able to stamp out their own images and leverage those. But we also want kind of public images out there that are available to be able to run and try for kind of demo POC use cases. And if somebody is willing to actually run images provided by somebody else, then they have some that they can run with. And those currently right now are manually created and hosted under a Heptio-owned AWS account. And we've been looking at potentially migrating those to a CNCF-owned account. But we have other issues to address there as far as how would we handle automated updates for security and things like that for a CNCF-hosted account.
Okay, so if the users are creating their own images and they're storing it in some, the link between where the image is stored and then actually creating a cluster with the image is completely manually managed.
Yep.
I would say previously, so as soon as you want to use encrypted root volumes, you need to copy an image, even if it's public. So typically in the past, where I've worked, we've maintained a set of images for customers to consume, and then it's copied into their account, and then they customize it further for use. So they keep the timestamps from like the source, and then tailor it for their own ends.
Okay, I don't have anything else to show. I mean, I just wanted to explain what our stamping requirements was, and I wanted to show, sorry, telemarketers. I also wanted to show, a stamping mechanism that is really nice and clean that we've used in the past at VMware. So,
yeah, I appreciate coming to talk about it, Mark. I think from a SIG cluster lifecycle perspective, this has a lot of possibilities. I don't want to see it just kind of drop. But I do think that there's going to be a time window for when somebody can adopt it in maturation process. These open-ended questions kind of would need to be addressed along the way too as well.
Yeah.
So I think I don't know what the plan is, if there is a plan about stamping, but I think maybe writing down a doc to have the idea in place, and then we could circulate in SIG cluster lifecycle if you wanted to see if there's a broader audience that folks are interested in then tagging along on this one.
Okay, I wouldn't mind working on it with somebody else from the AWS side who is familiar with your stamping requirements and approach. Or I could take. Go ahead.
I was going to say I'm more than happy to help you out with that, Load.
Okay, that's great.
All right. Any other topics, questions, comments, concerns? All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye.
Later all.